Tokyo Bay, nightfall, March 9 to 10, 1945. The sea is black glass under a low moon. 4 R-3350s hammer the fuselage like distant thunder. The bomber rides through ash and sparks, low and heavy, the air tasting of carbon and salt. Inside the cockpit, the flight engineer watches the needles creep, oil hot, cylinder heads hotter, numbers edging toward the line that swallows engines whole. Below, the city blooms into fire. Updrafts punch the wings. The airplane shudders as the superchargers howl. One engine surges in temperature, then another. The engineer reaches for a guarded toggle under a strip of red tape, a switch never mentioned in any manual wired in on a coral runway weeks earlier by a quiet electrician with burned knuckles and a flashlight in his teeth. He flips it. The cowl-flaps bite the slipstream and over-travel past their stop. Drag blooms, speed bleeds. The pilot trims against the sink. Fresh air floods the cowls. The temperatures falter, then fall. Mixture steadies. The engine lives. Over the burning grid below, a hand-sized piece of judgment buys time, and with it, distance. To understand how that switch came to exist, we have to return to where the B-29 learned to survive. The B-29's path to Tokyo began years earlier, in heat. Boeing's new giant first flew in 1942, a pressurized, turbocharged promise meant to carry war across oceans. Its heart was the Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone, a 2,200 horsepower radial whose power came with a price. Long climbs at heavy weight pushed temperatures toward limits measured in seconds. Cylinder heads lived on a knife edge. Oil coked in the dark corners of nacelles. Fire was the overseer no crew forgot. On paper, the airplane was elegant. 4 engines, 4 General Electric turbo superchargers, and a flight engineer's station that centralized engine control. In reality, it was a negotiation with heat and drag. Airflow over the cylinders was managed by cowl-flaps. Curved doors at the trailing edge of each cowling. Open them, and cool air washed through the fins. Open too far, and drag multiplied, speed bled, and the airplane sagged. Close them, and you gained range but gave up margin. Every takeoff, climb, and bomb run balanced those competing needs. Before the Marianas, the type was baptized in the Battle of Kansas, a frantic winter push in early 1944 to fix and deliver B-29s that were late, heavy, and temperamental. Crews watched new engines torch on test stands and on the ramp. Technical orders were rewritten. Baffling around cylinders, thin metal guides that forced air through the tightest passages was improved and resealed. But the R-3350 remained a hot engine, especially in the left front cylinders, starved by imperfect airflow and high workload. The first combat missions came from India and China under XX Bomber Command. The 58th Bomb Wing hauled bombs and fuel over the Himalayas to forward bases near Chengdu. The inaugural strike on the Iwata Steel Works, 15th of June 1944, carried more political weight than destructive effect. It also laid bare the operational truth. In tropical heat, with long takeoff rolls, gross weight high, and climbs stretched thin over the plateau, engines ran out of thermal headroom. Abort rates and diversions piled up for mundane, unforgiving reasons. Needle rise, detonation, and fire warnings that sent crews back over mountains they had barely cleared. Summer 1944 saw the Marianas campaign wrest Saipan, Tinian, and Guam from Japanese forces. Those coral islands became the hinge of the air war. Aviation Bomber Command moved in. The 73rd Bomb Wing flew from Saipan. The 313th assembled on Tinian. The 314th would arrive on Guam. New limestone runways ate propeller tips with dust and salt. Humidity crept into wiring. Maintenance ran day and night in the open, under floodlights and the damp breath of the Pacific. The distances to Japan were at the edge of the useful load curve. Crews staged fuel and traded bomb tonnage for range, then traded again for cooling margin. Inside the cockpit, The flight engineer watched the cowl-flap indicators as faithfully as manifold pressure and RPM. Normal practice was precise. Take off with cowl flaps set for maximum safe cooling, then reduce opening as airspeed and altitude built, and temperatures settled. Cylinder head temperature had a ceiling, around 500 degrees Fahrenheit, beyond which valve guides seized, detonation spiked, and the path to failure steepened. Manuals warned, do not open the flaps fully at high speed. Do not chase the needle into overspeed or structural buffet. Each nacelle's flaps were driven by electric motors through gearboxes to limit switches. Those switches defined stop and safe, protecting the airplane from the instinct to fling everything open at once. But the flight line's reality was less tidy. A hot day, a heavy bomb load, and a savage updraft could erase the margins the book depended on. Turbo superchargers amplified the engine's own heat. Intercoolers helped, but not enough when the air itself arrived hot and thin. On climb-out, a crew could follow the checklist and still watch the CHT scrape the red arc. You could shallow the climb, open the flaps within limits, enrich the mixture, and pray for cooler air, yet still run out of options. It was here, between doctrine and survival, that a handful of maintainers began to search the airplane for just a little more. On Tinian, an aircraft electrician stood inside a warm nacelle with a flashlight between his teeth and a wiring diagram spread over the engine mount. Night insects drifted in the beam. The surf hissed beyond the runway. He traced the cowl-flap circuit with a fingernail. Motor, gearbox, reversing relay, limit switches, open and close. The logic was simple. Power flowed until a cam hit a microswitch and the circuit went dead. That was the safeguard. It was also the wall crews kept hitting when heat outpaced the book. The idea was not elegant. It was practical. He added a short bypass, a guarded, momentary line that fed the open side of the cowl-flap motor, even after the open limit switch cut out. It did not defeat the normal controls. It did not change the close limit. It gave the flight engineer a narrow, handheld authority to nudge the flaps a few degrees past the prescribed stop when heat demanded it. If the toggle was released, the circuit returned to normal. If abused, drag would punish the airplane instantly. The switch was taped and marked. It was a tool, not a new procedure. Technical orders were clear, no unauthorized modifications. Engineering officers had careers tied to compliance. The cowl flaps themselves had speed limits for a reason. At high dynamic pressure, over-opening could flex linkages, hammer hinges, and set up buffet along the nacelle. On paper, there was no debate. On the ramp, there were burned engines and empty bunks. Between those truths, the men who kept the B-29s breathing made choices and took responsibility for them. The first test happened on the ground. Chocks in, brakes set, ground power on. The engineer ran the flaps to full open, watched the indicator stop, and then held the new guarded toggle. The motor engaged again. The flap moved just a little, past its usual position. No strange noise, no bind. Back to neutral. Then another nudge. Enough to show that the limit was conservative, not the end of travel. The ship taxied and ran up on the end of the coral strip. Nothing shook loose. The modification stayed quiet. A post-maintenance check flight took the next step. Heavy fuel, clean air, climb established. CHT crept toward the red arc. The engineer tried the toggle for 3 seconds, then 5. The needle hesitated, then sagged 10-15 degrees Fahrenheit. Not a miracle, just margin. A few seconds of extra cooling let mixture and boost stay where range demanded. Another crew tried it on a humid afternoon when the island air felt like bathwater. Same result. The drop was modest but real, and it came exactly when needed most, on the edge of the envelope where decisions multiplied or vanished. Word traveled the way it always does. A crew chief spoke to another over a cigarette. A flight engineer mentioned a new emergency assist to a friend in the next hardstand. A guarded toggle appeared on a handful of panels, always explained face to face. The instructions were short. Use it only when you're out of options. Hold it only as long as you must. Expect drag. Expect a sink rate. You are trading speed for cooling, seconds at a time. Watch your numbers. Trust your pilot. Respect the air. Some engineering sections refused outright. Some allowed it under strict caution, noting it in forms in careful language. Emergency cowl-flap override installed, and adding verbal warnings thicker than the ink. Nobody pretended it changed the airplane. What it did was bend the line between red and survivable by the width of a toggle. In the months ahead, that width would be measured not in theory, but over cities where the air was smoke and the horizon was on fire. The real test came when the bombers went in, low, hot, and fast over Tokyo on a March night built of wind and flame. The order was simple and radical. Night, low, fast. General Curtis LeMay had stripped the B-29s of most guns, kept the tail stinger, and loaded them deep with E-46 clusters of M69 incendiaries. Takeoff on the evening of March 9, 1945. Cross the long dock to Honshu. Hit Tokyo from 5,000 to 7,000 feet. Let fire do what high-altitude precision could not. Hundreds of superfortresses rose from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, 73rd, 313th, and 314th bomb wings, spaced on the climb, lights out, engines hot. The air was tropical and dense. Gross weights pressed tires into coral. Cowl-flaps sat open more than crews liked. Cylinder head temperatures ran high before the ocean even fell behind. Mixture and RPM balanced on a thin line between range and ruin. Midnight neared. The coast came up as a blacker darkness against the sea. The first pathfinders crossed the shoreline shortly after 0:00, laying markers and flares that glowed in the haze. The bombers followed in streams. Searchlights probed and faltered. The first sticks of M69s fell into wooden wards, splitting into burning bomblets that chewed through roofs and set tatami and paper screens alight. Within minutes, Tokyo began to breathe fire. Updrafts hit like fists. Downdrafts took whole seconds away. The wakes of other B-29s rolled the wings. Engines, already hot from the long run-in, spiked again as the bombers flew through superheated air. One ship in the stream watched number 2 edge past the number the engineer would not cross. Manual called for more mixture, less power, careful cowl management. There was nowhere left to go. The needle did not care. The engineer lifted the red tape and thumbed the guarded switch. The cowl-flap motor engaged against its own stop. The flaps crept a few degrees into forbidden air. The penalty arrived immediately. Drag, a sink, the pilot trimming hard to keep place in the flow over the target. But the airflow through the nacelle thickened. Hot fins saw cooler air. The cylinder head temperature paused. Then it eased, 10, 15 degrees. Detonation risk fell back from the brink. Power could stay. Fuel flow could hold. Bomb doors opened into the heat and slipstream. The airplane shook as clusters tumbled free. The city below turned to a sheet of embered wind, pulling air in at the ground and venting it skyward as a single red column. Oil temperatures lifted in sympathy with the fire. Turbos whistled. Intercoolers did what they could. On the engineer's panel, one needle wandered again. He used the toggle in short bursts, 3 seconds, then off, 5 seconds, then off, buying cooling without letting the drag pull him out of the bomber stream. The practice was deliberate. It was not a new way to fly. It was a way to keep flying. Flak stitched through the murk below, more sporadic than at altitude but still fatal to the unlucky. Fighters rose, too few and too late, driven off by speed, darkness, and tail guns that still watched the rear arc. The real enemy was the air itself. Soot drifted into intakes. Convection clawed at propeller discs. Every instrument seemed to feel the firestorm's hand. In that air, a few degrees of relief mattered more than the catechism of ideal drag. The bypass made room for judgment when the numbers ran out of space. Bombs gone. The crews turned for the bay and open water. The city's light followed them for miles, a sunrise on the wrong horizon. Engines still ran hot on egress. The toggle came out again when downdrafts slammed the wings and pushed the gauges higher. A few seconds, a small drop. Enough to keep mixtures from going wastefully rich, enough to keep power where the group needed it. The B-29 stretched back toward the Marianas on fumes and arithmetic, each choice adding up to endurance. By dawn, the returning stream staggered in over coral and concrete, scorched and salt-stained. Ground crews counted patches and looked at faces grey with ash. Flight engineers compared CHT numbers and what it took to keep them alive in the furnace. Word, as it always did, began to travel along the hardstands. The stream turned again on March 11th. Nagoya burned under low clouds and wind. The bombers came in at 5,000 to 7,000 feet, light on guns and heavy on E-46 clusters. The same heat rose off the city's wooden wards. The same turbulence rolled along the wings. Engines started the run already warm from the long leg over water. The cowl-flap trick was there like a last match in a pocket. Not policy, not doctrine, just a decision within reach of a thumb. 2 nights later, it was Osaka. Then Kobe on the 16th, Nagoya again on the 18th, 19th. Each run had its own weather, its own rivers of fire that changed the air from minute to minute. Some ships sailed through with needles steady and engines content. Others hit pockets of convective fury that drove oil and cylinder head temperatures higher in a breath. In that air, flight engineers went back to the toggle in measured bursts. Drag, then relief. A short sink. Then a small fall in temperature that kept the red lines away. Pilots learned to expect it, a gentle pressure on the yoke, a slight retrim. The stream held together despite the penalties of cooling. Low-altitude firebombing changed the calculus of fuel and power. The airplane flew faster over the ground than at altitude, but the air was thick, and the engines worked harder in the heat and turbulence. Range was a number earned second by second. To keep it, crews lived on the knife edge of auto-lean mixture and conservative power. The bypass mattered because it bought those seconds without forcing a shift to wastefully rich mixture for cooling. 10 degrees of cylinder head mercy could hold the line on fuel flow. Held long enough, it could be the difference between clearing Iwo Jima on fumes or turning a dead engine into a ditching. There were limits. Nobody tried to run past the stop for minutes. Nobody could afford the drag. Some aircraft didn't have the switch. Some crews refused to use it. But for those who did, the pattern became a kind of craft. Use it in the climb until the night air takes hold. Use it near the target when the air bites. Use it on egress when downdrafts slam the wing and the gauges run. Only as long as you must. Only as far as you dare. Ground crews learned to spot the ships that had used the bypass by feel. Cowl-flap hinges came back with fresh scuffs of wear. Linkages showed a shine where the stop had been kissed. No cracks, no tears. Just the marks of a door pressed farther into the wind than the manual allowed. Engineering officers watched and weighed the trade. A warning here, a signed acknowledgement there. The line between reckless and necessary is often a pencil mark in a damp tent. The rumor that followed was not general orders. It was a story told over enamel mugs and engine stands. A crew out of Saipan saved number 3 long enough to get bombs off Osaka. Another out of Tinian kept number 2 from running away on the Kobe run and made it home with gas gauges that refused to rise off empty. A Guam ship lost a turbo and leaned on the toggle through a winter of downdrafts until the numbers came back. Names blurred as the raids piled up, but the instrument readings remained sharp. By April, the practice had a shadow ledger. A crew chief chalked a mark on a hut wall each time a ship returned with an engine that had brushed the red and lived because of a momentary overopen. Other chiefs added their own tallies. 50 marks appeared before the rains came. Nobody pretended each mark was a saved engine in the strictest sense. Some were near misses that yielded to cooler air. Some were runs where the toggle made the difference between landing with power and landing with luck. But the number carried weight. 50 meant the idea had crossed from a rumor to a repeated choice. Inside the wings, attitudes shifted. Some squadrons put quiet qualifiers in their briefings, words like emergency cooling authority at flight engineer discretion, that let everyone know the bypass existed without naming it. Others refused to give ground and relied on stricter engine handling, better baffling, and improved seals to tame the R-3350's heat. The results overlapped. Abort rates for thermal issues trended downward as the spring wore on. Part of that was weather. Part was experience. Part was maintenance catching up with a hard airplane. Part, for the ships that had it, was a guarded switch under red tape used with discipline. The effect reached beyond the cockpit. Back on the hardstands, electricians compared notes. Some refined the wiring with better guards and clearer labels. Some removed the bypass after a stern talk with an engineering officer and left only the memory of where the wire had lain. Either way, the shared idea had moved the boundary between procedure and judgment. That movement mattered because the campaign was widening and the strain on engines and crews was not letting up. As spring tipped into summer, the lessons from those nights over Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe would shape how crews chiefs and commanders thought about cooling discipline and survivability, and what changes the organization would accept to bring more airplanes home. By morning, the numbers were ink on clipboards. Tokyo had burned across roughly 16 square miles. Casualty estimates ran into the tens of thousands, often cited near 100,000 dead. An industrial capital turned to coals and ash. More than 300 B-29s launched, around 270, 280 attacked. 14 were lost over the city or on the way home. Dozens limped back with holes, scorched paint, and engines that had run on the margin for hours. The mission's success set the pattern. Low, heavy, repeated. The question for the men who kept the airplanes alive was whether the machinery could stand the schedule. It began to. Part of the change was experience, part was weather. Part was an invisible scaffolding of small, disciplined choices in the cockpit and on the ramp. Crews refined engine handling into a ritual. Climb a touch slower. Don't chase altitude into heat. Keep mixtures on auto lean as long as the numbers allow. Don't close cowl flaps in hope. Close them when the needles say you can. On the ground, chiefs reworked baffles, resealed gaps with new material, and checked rigging on intercooler and oil cooler doors until the linkages felt like instruments. Air leaked less. Cooling air worked harder. Cylinder head temperatures peaked lower, and when they climbed, they fell faster. In this tightening loop, the guarded toggle found its place. It was not doctrine. It was an option. Flight engineers used it in seconds, not minutes. In the climb on wet nights when heat refused to yield. Over the target when the air turned malignant. On egress when downdrafts stacked the needles. The payoff was modest and specific. A few degrees of mercy at the exact moment the engine needed them. Enough to avoid an abrupt shift to auto-rich. Enough to preserve the range calculus. Enough to keep a cylinder head out of the seizure zone. Engineering officers who knew their ships, who read the same needles through their crew's eyes. Let the practice stand, with warnings attached. Abuses would be grounded. Judicious use would be remembered. Mission summaries in the weeks after Meetinghouse reflected multiple trends. Thermal-related aborts eased downward. Fewer engines were shut down in the climb. More ships reached the initial point with 4 R-3350s pulling. The change did not belong to a single switch. It belonged to cumulative craft. But the toggle mattered to the crews who had it, and they said so in the ways they could. Quiet notes in Form 1s, chalk marks on hut walls, a shared habit of touching a red-taped guard before a hard night. In a few squadrons, the number 50 became shorthand. 50 engines not lost to spikes that turned fatal. 50 near misses that did not become forced landings. 50 moments when judgment, not fear, ran the panel. Infrastructure changed the odds too. In March, Iwo Jima opened as an emergency field. B-29s that once faced a binary choice, make the Marianas or go into the Pacific, could drop into Iwo with engines hurt or fuel low. USAF records would tally thousands of emergency landings there before the war ended, each one a crew spared and a ship saved for another night. Against that larger safety net, the small local hedges, better baffles, sharper handling, and for some a bypass that bought seconds, added resilience to a force asked to fly hard, often, and hot. By summer, the fire raids had become a grim routine. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities were hit and hit again. The B-29s carried mines to the inland sea, too, strangling coastal traffic while the cities burned. Loss rates fell from the raw nights of March, though hazards never left the flight engineer's panel. Through it all, the lesson hardened. When the book ran out, the machine still had a little to give if the hands on it knew where to look and when to stop. That lesson did not end with Japan's cities. It flowed into how wings wrote their notes, how training officers briefed their crews, and how designers thought about cooling authority in big radials that would fly after the war, which leads directly to what the organization chose to remember and to formalize. In tent briefings and in the margins of maintenance logs, the lesson took shape. Not a blanket approval of anything wired under tape, but a quiet acceptance of the principle behind it. Give the flight engineer enough authority in seconds and inches to keep temperatures from running away when the air turns hostile. Wings refined power tables for hot weather. Crews were coached to step climb instead of forcing altitude into a single, punishing pull. Engineering officers emphasized cowl-flap rigging checks, intercooler door calibration, and baffle sealing as daily rituals rather than periodic chores. The airplane learned to keep its own heat at bay, inch by inch, until the numbers grew predictable. Parts and kits helped. Right field and depot channels pushed out improved baffle seals and hardware, along with technical notes that tightened tolerances around cowl and cooler doors. Squadrons cannibalized scrap rubber and thin aluminum to close gaps that factory sealant had missed or tropical service had unstitched. Chiefs taught younger mechanics what could and could not be bent to fit. Cowl-flap hinges and linkages came off for inspection more often. If the limits would be pressed, even briefly, the gear had to be true. The bypass remained what it began as, a local edge used by some units, shunned by others. No general order canonized it. Yet the vocabulary of emergency cooling authority, spoken softly in some briefings by spring, was a sign that the organization had absorbed the need for judgment. The practice did not magic away risk. It clarified it. If you must, open farther for moments. Expect drag. Expect to pay for that relief with trim and fuel. Stop as soon as the needle respects the line. The rule lived in the space between the engineer's hand and the pilot's trust. The broader scaffolding of survivability rose at the same time. Iwo Jima gave B-29s a runway where none had existed, and thousands of crews used it. P-51 escorts from Iwo and later from Okinawa thinned fighter threats, letting engineers concentrate more fully on their panels rather than on emergency power for combat. Loss rates eased, missions multiplied. The air campaign's momentum turned less on brute endurance and more on steady, cumulative reliability, a thing built from procedures, parts, and practiced hands. What the force chose to remember filtered into post-war thinking. Engineers and test pilots pushed for more granular engine instruments, better baffling as a starting point rather than a retrofit, and clearer language in manuals about emergency cooling. Not blanket prohibitions, but well-defined windows for judgment. Large radials that followed, the last of their line before turbines, carried more robust cowling, cleaner airflow paths, and control laws that recognized moments when a crew might need to trade speed for temperature without tearing up the airplane. The story was not that a single switch solved anything. It was that a small act of technical literacy, taken seriously, could reshape how an organization weighed risk. For the men who lived it, the memory settled into the work. Flight engineers who stayed in uniform or moved to civil transports taught the same habits. Read the needles, not your hopes. Make temperature management a loop, not a lurch. Build margin early. Use extraordinary means only when restraint has run its course. Mechanics taught their replacements to chase air leaks with the same zeal they chased oil leaks. Officers who had once frowned at guarded toggles grew comfortable telling crews what they were already doing. Exercise discretion briefly when the airplane asks you to choose between drag and damage. By August, fires across Japan were giving way to surrender broadcasts. Engines that had survived spring and summer limped into quiet. The war would close with statistics and ceremonies. What lingered in the hangars was humbler. A memory of metal that ran cooler because someone had traced a line on a diagram, and a cockpit that stayed composed because a hand knew when to hold a switch and when to let it go. From that memory rises a simple truth that spans machines and years, and it leads us to the last question the story asks. The truth is simple. Reckless is blind speed. Necessary is informed risk. Between them sits knowledge, hands that know the machine, eyes that read what the air is doing, minds that accept the cost and count it honestly. That guarded toggle was never a miracle. It was an inch of authority granted by someone who understood where the circuit stopped and why. It did not change the engine's nature. It changed the moment in which a crew could act. A few seconds of cooler air through hot fins, a few degrees off a number that breaks metal. Enough, sometimes, to bring 4 engines to the initial point or to keep 3 together long enough to clear the coast. The difference was discipline. Crews did not lean on the bypass as a habit. They reached for it only when the needles said there was no other choice. Ground crews did not pretend it erased limits. They built better baffles, sealed leaks, checked rigging, and kept the option guarded under red tape. Officers who allowed it did so with warnings, not winks. That is how judgment becomes practice without becoming excuse. In the long view, this is how big wars are won. Not only by plans and tonnage, but by thousands of narrow decisions made well. The B-29 campaign turned when high theory met hard craft. When to climb and how fast. How much cowl and when. How to keep range without cooking valves. The lore of 50 engines saved is not a statistic. It is a way of remembering what those choices felt like in real time. Seconds measured by heat and drag. Distance bought a breath at a time. The nameless electrician on a coral strip did not change history alone. He joined a chain of people who refused to let the book be the end of thought. Their work echoed forward into cleaner cowlings, clearer manuals, sturdier instruments, and a culture that trusts trained hands with narrow, temporary authority when the air turns hostile. On nights when the ocean was black and the horizon burned, victory sometimes came down to the width of a switch and the steadiness with which it was held. That steadiness is the legacy. It is the line between reckless and necessary, drawn in the glow of a panel, held by a crew that knew its machine, and released the moment the engine ran cool again.